So thank you very much to the organizers, to Roman, to Juliet, and to Philip for inviting us here. This is really an incredible collusion of different subjects around this simplicity, around simplicity. So I will speak today about sandboxes for simplicity in the framework of going back and forth between simplicity and complexity. This has been addressed by several of you here already. What I plan to do is rather take a little bit of perspective of what has happened in one part of mathematics, one part of that part of mathematics, mathematical logic, and one subpart of that, model theory. In the last, I would say, 80 years, there have been several kind of revolutions in model theory that have slowly created this sort of motion between simplicity and complexity, and back to simplicity, and back to complexity in some cases. What I want to pose it is that we really should see this as in a dynamical way. There is some kind of dynamical simplicity. It was already addressed by Curtis Franks, for instance, with different words, or by Etienne yesterday. I want to illustrate this with some examples coming from model theory practice. The examples I want to show they're essentially from 3 times. One of them from 1930, roughly. The other one from around 1990, and the other one very current at the very end. So somehow the topics of the lecture somehow follow this particular line. So the one-way direction going from complicated proofs to their simplifications that has been advocated by Rota, by Hilbert. Of course, in Hilbert it's much more complex than a one-way path, but there is some kind of unidirectionality that is in some people's minds when they think about simplicity, when they speak about simplicity. You go from the complicated to the simple. Well, it may be well defined. It has been defined here at least in 2 or 3 different ways, by Rosalie Imhoff, for instance, or by different. But it may be naive in the sense that it only reflects very partially mathematical practice of dealing with simplification of a proof. So as a mathematician, we deal constantly with trying to simplify a proof, but sometimes we have to, and I want to describe how we start from a simple question. We may need to first write a very complicated proof. We run into extremely strong barriers, and then we have to go to simplify the question again. We have to go to a more complicated world. So sometimes there is this kind of duality. It depends on the world where you place your question. If you want to stick to one simple world for your question will keep being complicated. Whereas if you allow yourself to become more complicated, less simple, in looking for the world where you want to analyze your question, the question itself may be made simpler, and then you can go back to the original question. That's somehow the idea of those sandboxes of simplicity. So in a category theory, we have a fancy word for what could be described as mathematical spirals of some sort, adjoints in category theory. And I think there is some kind of adjointness between simplification and making complex, having the many folds that you have in complex, as was described yesterday by Etienne Guise, and having this single fold, simple situation. The illustration here is Spiral by Andy Goldsworthy that somehow illustrates this sort of movement. You're not really going back to the same place. You're going back to something that projects to the same place, but you're going up with this ice spiral. You have this back and forth motion between simplicity and complexity. So this sort of a description may resonate with some of you. It's, of course, in the life of mathematicians, it is more complicated than this, and we don't really think, oh, I'm going to think about a simple question, then. But somehow I'm trying to describe what ends up happening in some situations. You start from a simple question. I think good questions in mathematics tend to be, the best questions tend to be simple questions. So we start from a simple point. You go to a complicated definition, a more complicated construction, or a proof, a very complicated proof that may take many pages of really terribly difficult to understand and to communicate symbols. So this phenomenon that Misha Gromov was mentioning here yesterday, that we really need a lot of training, enormous training to do these definitions and constructions and proofs, is there and cannot really be completely avoided. But there is later a simplification of the proof, capturing better the definition or putting the definition in a different framework, maybe by the same author or usually by later authors. Then you go to generalization, you go to further complexities very often. Sometimes the generalization brings new complexities that were not visible, that were projected, a little bit like the spiral projects to a circle. You couldn't see the new dimension happening there, but these complexities lead then to new simple questions, and then the circle restarts. So there is a lot of this dynamic situation in mathematics. One can think, well, you want to have the final proof, the simplest proof, and that was described also yesterday several times, and also it's implicit in the 24th problem. However, my view is that somehow that simple proof is usually the starting point for a new roundabout. So, as I was saying, I plan to illustrate this now. So let us start with the illustration of this with three mathematical situations that come from, as I was saying, mathematical logic. Let me give some credits very quickly, to some of the pointers, some of the influences. Of course, this is always a very incomplete list, and if you yourself know that you have, produced some of the insights that I will be using. I apologize, but somehow I mentioned here some of the lines that, in some written work or in some discussions. There is this book by Salamea, Synthetic Philosophy of Contemporary Mathematics, and many discussions with Alejandro Martin. There are many discussions also going on with Roman Cossack, based on Giancarlo Rota, on Petitot as well. Boris Zilber, is one of the main. I credit him for opening my eyes to many of the things that happen between mathematics and other parts, philosophy, through his work between model theory and mathematical physics. We're, together with some other people, we're trying to do actual mathematical work in that direction. We have achieved a few things that I may mention at some point. Then there are these generalized definability hierarchies by Van Anen, and then there is a work on early Gödel and formalism freeness by Juliet. Then, of course, many conversations with Baldwin, Grossberg, and so on. There are many things that somehow converge in this sort of thing. So let us start. Before starting, let me just mention this work by Oscar Muñoz. He's a Colombian artist. Volverse aire means becoming air. So this work, this is a faucet, and there is some kind of painting. This is actually Oscar Muñoz himself in ink. And of course, as the faucet starts to drain, you can follow the line, and finally the picture of Oscar Muñoz disappears in the water. So you can see this is, I think, a good starting point for for this sort of a revolving motion that's happening at this point. So 1930s, but I'm going to take a non-orthodox vision of the 1930s very quickly. The most usual vision of the role of Gödel's theorem basically stresses the mortal blow it gave to Hilbert's problem. That's the usual way. There are here real specialists in this, and people who have written fantastic books on this. I'm just describing a different perspective very quickly. So usually completeness is seen as previous to incompleteness, as a predecessor in a chronological and mathematical and philosophical way. But some authors, it's actually in a textbook by Van Anen, in a mathematical logic textbook, have stressed this different view. Incompleteness is essentially prior to completeness, not the opposite way. Of course, the publication was first completeness, then incompleteness, but let's take this non-orthodox view. And okay, this is a coincidence. This also appeared yesterday, this particular, in Rachel's lecture. The completeness theorem simplifies, in a way, issues that were complex from the perspective of the incompleteness theorem. That's one way of seeing things. So the path is you go from the Hilbert question then to Gödel's incompleteness theorem that makes the world complex in some way, and then Gödel's completeness theorem can be seen as some kind of reparation of what happened in incompleteness. So the chronology, of course, as I was saying, is wrong here, but I'd like to take this stance for the reason I'm going to stress in a moment. There is also Juliette Kennedy's study of Gödel's letters and diaries and the Carnap diaries and so on, where somehow the birth of these ideas of completeness, incompleteness, categoricity, another idea that is related to this here, is somehow completely entangled and completely mixed in the late 20s or early 30s. And it seemed to go in a kind of an infinite sequence like this, from simplicity to complexity to simplicity. It's some kind of a sequence that may resonate with some people. So let me mention 3 old theorems in the family of incompleteness. They're not chronologically given, of course. There is indefinability of definability by Tarski. So the binary relation that says that M is a Gödel number of a formula defining the nth arithmetically definable set is not, it's the relation itself that captures definability is not a definable relation. In definability of truth, same family, the set of Gödel codes, of Gödel numbers, of true sentences is not an arithmetic set. And then the incompleteness theorem by Gödel, so all of these are negatives in definability, in of truth or of definability, or incompleteness. If an arithmetic axiomatic system is valid and recursive, then there exists some sentence that is true, but it is not an A theorem, it is not provable in the system. This was also discussed by some people yesterday. So we reach this sort of blocking situation here, like in Serra's, well, this doesn't exist anymore, but in the plaza, lower Manhattan, this was there for a number of years. Unfortunately, this was torn down, and we can no longer see this piece by Serra, but there was this sort of blocking given by these negatives. Maybe I was thinking they should have, built some kind of tunnel underneath or something, because people complained that they couldn't go directly from the right-hand side to the left-hand side in the plaza. So anyway, in mathematics, what happened? So this is again a description of that situation. You have the natural numbers on the right. Yeah, there's a pointer here. Oh, I don't know. Okay, yes. There is the natural numbers. Then some numbers code truths of the natural numbers. And this blue zone here is the accessible zone for theorems. But then Gödel produces this sentence that is true, so it's in this green area, but is outside of the blue area of things that you can reach, somehow through your kind of dynamical system of proving things. So that was a key point, that is the key point to the 3 theorems that were mentioned before. And perhaps one thing that one should stress is that here we have the natural numbers, and in a way, everything is happening only inside the natural numbers there. So your codes are in the natural numbers. What is true is evaluated in the natural numbers. Your world is the natural numbers. And one way of seeing this is, yes, they are simple. They are 0, 1, and 2, and we know them. We have known them forever, since the Greeks. And why make things more complicated by looking at different versions of the natural numbers? But as it turns out, insisting on that simplicity of the structure is what creates the huge complication that I stressed in the slides before. So the solution, completeness, as a solution to this situation, yes, essentially is possible by freeing yourself from that one particular simple world and looking at many possible worlds. So if you allow yourself to look at not just the standard model of the natural numbers, but you allow yourself to look at all the non-standard versions of the natural numbers, all the models of that particular theory, then actually you can gain completeness. You can go back to completeness, you can go back to a simplification of that theory. So let me stress this point. All these incompleteness results that I was mentioning before reveal some sort of an imbalance between the syntax and the semantic side, the semantics. The imbalance is, of course, extremely productive in many different ways, but one of the reasons it is there is by insisting on fixing one simple model. If you forgo that particular kind of simplicity, take all the possible models, and classifying models of arithmetic is difficult. I mean, Roman Kozak has written a book, co-authored a book on models of arithmetic, and it's a big volume full of very difficult questions, and there are many open, very complicated issues about models of arithmetic, so it's not a simple world at all. It's one of the most complicated worlds that have been produced, the structure of all models of arithmetic. But if you allow yourself to work in such worlds, you pay the price of having to look at complicated structures, but then you get, again, a solution to this incompleteness phenomenon. You get a completeness theorem by allowing yourself to go there. So it's like some sort of use of Leibniz in a certain way. So this dynamical situation, going from simplicity to complexity to simplicity, allowing yourself to be complex here and then simple here, and then perhaps, oh, maybe I want to simplify this side and make complex this side. This is something that happens in mathematics simultaneously all the time. It is dynamic, and it creates these sort of long sequences of sorts. There are other ruptures like this. That was the rupture of the 1930s, and it's major. Maybe I just illustrate them. So I put this Irma Laukkanen, this is a Finnish artist, many different worlds creating a picture. That's the completeness theorem, and that first revolution in model theory, it opened our field, essentially. There are some other, this doesn't really mean anything, but you can actually have structures that vary, that are no longer static structures, but variable structures. Those are sheaves, and there is a whole model theory of sheaves. I won't say anything else about model theory of sheaves, but that's another rupture. Sometimes things become simpler if you don't fix your model, but allow your model to vary in a continuous way. One particular example of that situation is the forcing techniques. Another rupture goes through essentially allowing yourself to take values in an interval 0, 1, building on many valued logics, building on Lukasiewicz and so on, but allowing yourself to build a continuous model theory. And finally, what I symbolize by this amalgamation diagram, getting rid even of formulas. And that's the next stage I will describe. So these are possible ruptures. The work in getting rid of formulas, I will describe it a little bit more carefully, was started by Schellach in the 1980s, roughly, and there has been a lot of work in that direction starting from the 1990s, and it is continuing. And the work in model theory and sheaves has a connection to Grothendieck, an early connection to Grothendieck, and in a way was much slower to really start. So McIntyre many years ago, and then some other people, and later Ellerman and Caicedo, they have built a whole model theory on sheaves that allows one to understand dynamical situations in a more natural way than we do in usual model theory. But let me then let's go back to the past. Before going to 1990, let us go back 200 years in time. So Novalis, in his Allgemeine Brouillon, so I don't know if that's the original title, maybe it was just his notes. He wanted to build some kind of encyclopedia 200 years ago of many different things. He speaks about, well, he was a geologist, he was a poet, of course. I mean, Novalis is known as a poet, but he made his living by working in some mines as some sort of geologist, but he actually knew a lot of the mathematics that was happening in his time and a lot of the chemistry. This work has many things to say, at least to me, I hope to you as well, not just about simplicity, but about what we are doing. So there is this quote, for instance, initially there are no simple definitions. The more we simultaneously define, the more correct every single definition becomes. There is also this dynamical aspect here at play, or I can read it that way. Defining en masse science, definition is the formula for the construction of concepts, etc. Goes on and on. It's a poetic mind, but he really was attuned to things that, well, around 1800, this apparently was completely, people started doing editions of this Allgemeine Brouillon much later. Let me speak about definable sets. So in model theory, the set is called definable in a structure A. So a structure A, think the natural numbers if you want, or think the real numbers with their order, or your preferred structure. If there exists a formula, so you attach a formula to that particular structure, such that your definable set is the set of all solutions, the set of all A in A satisfying the formula. I will give an example in a moment. D can also be called the locus of the formula in A. Here are some examples. Elliptic curves, they are important in mathematics. They generalize conics. They're kind of a, upper degree conics, one more dimension only. So your formula is something like this. So something that many people have seen, without even having to call this formula. And the definable set, D, for this particular formula, is, as I wrote before, the solution set for this, with these parameters, A, B, and C. Here is, as an illustration, a family of some of the results that you can get in some projections. Anyway, so these are some important objects. And let me just go one step generalization and say how things somehow happen there. So you have formulas that define some sets. You have sets that are defined by two formulas, by many formulas, by infinite sets of formulas. The concept is called a type. In mathematical logic, it's called, in model theory, the type of an element over some set. And it is, again, like a recipe. You just list all the possible formulas that this element here satisfies with respect to all the elements in your set C. So you have like a test set, that's C. You can use it for your description. And then you have your language, and you can use your language to describe all the possible situations that A happens to fulfill with respect to C. So in particular, the type of 2 over the rational numbers, it's, well, I am 1 plus 1, and that's, and all the consequences of being 1 plus 1. Not very sophisticated at that point. This is slightly more interesting. The type of the square root of 2 is, if I multiply x by x, that's 1 plus 1, that means square root of 2, plus consequences. Then the type of pi, the type of an irrational number, that's more interesting here. You have to say, I am not the root of any polynomial if I take the polynomial with rational coefficients. That's being, that's being pi, but it is also being e, and that's also being any non-algebraic number, any transcendental number. Okay, so these are examples of these types. You can think of them as generalized curves of some sort, generalized loci. So you had the locus, you had the loci, and then you have these types are generalized loci. Anyway, so just as you had definable sets, you have these type definable sets, which correspond to turning things around. Now you give just a set of equations, a set of formulas, and you want to ask yourself, is there a solution to that? And if there is such a solution, well, put all your solutions together, and that's what's being defined by that particular type. This is a picture of the situation. So here you have the set of parameters. It was called C in the previous slide. I apologize, here it's A. And so this is like your test ground. And you can say, well, do I satisfy all this infinite set of equations or set of formulas? If yes, then I am in the type P. If I take now a different type, Q, do I satisfy? Well, yes. And I have points here that satisfy all these connections with respect to A. So you see, it's a very, it's defined in terms of formulas, but it's already, at the level of this picture, an extremely kind of compelling and basic geometric object. And we'll see a little bit of that particular line in a moment. So the role of definable and type definable sets is similar to the role of ideals in algebraic geometry. This Okay. Sorry. Okay, so in any case, these are the basic building blocks of information. That's perhaps what's important here. These are the basic blocks of information. You build model theory by analyzing definable sets, at least internally, and by analyzing type definable sets, and by analyzing the way different types interact with other types. So types are like these generalized curves that we have in model theory, in a way, and we analyze what kind of situations can we have, how many of these situations can we have. We start trying to build some invariants of these basic blocks, of these types. Some variants of these concepts, so I defined it here as a set of formulas. If this resonates with you, this means something. It's a risky closed set. If not, that doesn't really matter. But number 3 tells you there is some symmetry. They are orbits, and they're symmetries, and they're automorphisms of big models, of monster models, of huge models where you place all the solutions to what you are doing. There are more recent descriptions. Measures, states, distributions are all some instances or some forms of types. So you see, it's one of these prosaic phenomena or definition. It's the same definition. It has many different faces, completely different, and you can use them depending on what you want. That kind of revolution that happens in the 1980s, 1990s, I call it the breakup of compactness. Here the illustration is just a work by Nur Ul-Ain, very complex work, that somehow stratifies all the possible structures. The pictures we make when we try to describe to ourselves what we're doing, well, this reminds me of the sort of pictures we do. We have to build many towers of models, and we have to build many complicated systems of symmetries of all these objects. And this piece of work of a Canadian artist, Nur Ul-Ain, to me, it really looks kind of similar to the sort of pictures that we are doing. That's a complex world. That's a very complex world, in a way. And it is complex because we are still trying to clarify many of the phenomena that happen there. So you could say, you had a simple world with your nice structures. Why do you want to embed them in this complicated, kind of mesh of work? Okay, but the problem is, going back to the dual move, this is becoming less simple. The compactness theorem is lost. That's somehow the phenomenon that happens there, that loss of simplicity. But somehow we have, in a way, simpler notions of type and class. In a way, simpler. We can control them in different ways. And the hope, of course, is that, as has happened several times in mathematics, going up to this sort of complicated world at some point will allow us to say simpler things in the basic, simpler world that was there originally. This is again the same artist illustrating what is going on there. This sort of infinite towers growing in many directions and amalgamating, or not, many of the situations there. Okay, so here the focus changes to stronger languages, so more complicated, stronger quantifiers, or weaker languages, or even no language. Yes, in some cases, it's really the embeddings between all these models and closure properties. The technical word that appears there is abstract elementary classes. There are some more descriptions, but let me change the focus again and end. This is again the same Oscar Munoz, and this is on the high line. It's there right now. So if you want to see another work by the same Oscar Munoz, the Fawcett one, you can go to Skyline. And in any way, somehow the change of focus, going from formulas to embeddings, is another one of these situations where you have this switch of going from a simple world to a more complicated world, where somehow the concept may be tamed because they act in a freer way there. Perhaps let me finish with this quote then, because I only have 1 minute left, essentially. So a second quote by Novalis, I think, is a good way to end here. It's an early end, and there are a few more things that I wanted to say, but it always happens. So He describes theory of art. Are technical definitions and formulae for constructions the same as prescriptions? So remember these types as prescriptions of some properties you wanted to have. Natural theory of art. An element is a product of art. There are as yet no element. However, ones of this kind should be made. Should art be a differentiation and integration of the spirit? Physical theory of art. How few people have a genius for experimenting. The true experimenter, and that's the sandbox where you go to experiment. I won't say anything else about the sandbox, but you somehow saw a version of that here. Must have a dim feeling. I don't know if gut feeling is this same thing as dim feeling for nature within himself, which, depending on the perfection of his faculties, guides him with unfailing surety along his path, allowing him to discover and determine with much greater precision the hidden and decisive phenomenon. Thus, the true lover of nature distinguishes himself by his skill in multiplying and simplifying, again, combining, analyzing, romanticizing, and popularizing the experiments by his ability in inventing new experiments. I think this can be a good point to stop. And about the sandboxes, they were going to appear, but if you're interested, we may speak about that later. Thank you very much.